Hello, everybody. This is the third live stream of the Design System Social Club. I am very pleased to announce that we have new members to the club today to talk about Figma. First, we have Katie. Hi, Katie.
Hi.
Hi. Do you want to introduce yourself briefly? Like what you do,
Sure.
where do you work?
Yes.
And I don't know, anything else that you find relevant at this point?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie. I'm a senior UX engineer at Car Gurus based out of Boston. I work on the developer experience team, and I've been building our design system over the past year and a half.
Nice.
Just kind of getting ramped up in Figma, so definitely have some opinions to share today.
Cool. And we have Donna. Hey, Donna. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. So I'm Donna Vitan. I am the design lead for the TELUS design system at TELUS Digital in Canada. And yeah, so for the past year, we kind of put a hold on our design system team, but now we're again ramping up our design system to kind of help support our team again and what the next evolution looks like. So really excited to talk about Figma.
Nice. Well, welcome. I'm very excited to have like new members to the club, and we're trying to, as we move forward, try to broaden the audience. Cool. Let's talk about Figma. So basically, I wanted to talk about it, or like propose that topic because after the Config 2021, did you actually follow the conference or not really? Maybe we should start.
I wasn't able to, but I'm planning to go back and watch.
Okay. What about you, Donna?
Yeah, so I caught some parts and then I have to catch up on some other parts.
Yeah, which is actually, I think, maybe like interestingly, I feel like online conferences have their pros and cons. I think in like I'm digressing already, but I think first of all, I thought the Figma conference was actually pretty well made, and I thought there was a lot of momentum around it. And so this is why I thought, well, maybe it would be time for us to talk about Figma and especially how it evolved like in the recent years and how it's like the hot thing now. Especially I feel when you're working in a team, and especially if you have a design system, I think I see more and more companies basically adopting it. So I personally, I work out into it if people don't know by now, but before that I was in a startup, and I basically lived 2 times the transition from Sketch to Figma in both companies. And so I feel like right now, like all I hear about is like either people already in Figma or people wanting to transition into Figma or people actually like in the middle of transitioning to it. Anyway, the conference to me is that it was great. It was really well made. And at the same time, I feel like the point of going to a real conference somewhere, if you can, now that we're hopefully all vaccinated, I hope you are too, is also like the fact that you can actually not take, like your work with you or stuff like that and be for 2 days focused on one thing. Because I know I've done the same thing. I was registered to, the Config 2021, but honestly, like, yeah, I followed a few of those things, and also like, like you have notifications, stuff like that, and I'm always like pulled into different conversations. So I think
It's so hard to turn your actual workday off. Like I think if you want to do an online conference, you have to like really commit and like quit Slack, have some snacks, like just turn the world off and go into it. And I wasn't able to for this one.
Yeah. Anyway, anything that you saw at the conference that really like sparked something, or like your highlights of whatever?
I think the one thing that I really caught was the Fig Jam part. So that was really memorable.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's definitely looking awesome. Did you actually try it?
I did, and then the thing is too is like we've tried Whimsy and Miro, and now it's just like, oh, way to introduce another one to possibly challenge these established apps.
Yeah, one more tool, right? And so at the same time, it's one more tool, and it's not. If you're already using Figma, maybe you feel like it's just like part of the package. which, if I understood correctly, is true now, but later on, it's actually an additional, I don't know how much, on top of what you're already paying for your license. So I think it's also interesting. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, but
Yeah, I didn't hear that part.
Yep. I think it's going to be on top of it. Katie, do you
Yeah.
I see you're nodding.
We just went enterprise, actually. So I was like just looking through the admin stuff today, and I noticed it's very specific. Like, it's free right now. It's in beta, implying that you're gonna be charged for it.
The one thing, though, that I was kind of like bummed out is that I am very fancy, and the first thing that I tried is to actually use it on my iPad with my pencil, because, to be honest with you, since I've been working remotely, the one thing that I'm missing is whiteboarding with my colleagues. And so I tried different things, but first of all, like, I'm sorry, I need a pen. Like, it will not be possible for me to actually whiteboard with the mouse or my finger or something like that. I hate signing with my finger, by the way. Like, if I can do like a public announcement, please stop making me sign with my finger. It feels like I'm 3-year-old. I hate it. So anyway, I don't know. How do you feel about that? Like, did you try when you tried FigJam, do you feel like it's good enough for you, or do you wish that something was added? Because to me, like, the minute it didn't work with my pencil, I was, oh crap, and I still need something. So anyway, how was your experience with FigJam?
I think mostly I use it for diagramming things, but I think to your point, like, if you want it to be more sketchy, I do miss having that pen. So sometimes I have to dust off the Wacom, like my really old Wacom, and like try and connect it, like, where's the chords? But like, doodling is off the table with the mouse.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, to me, like, this is exactly why I'm interestingly, I'm a visual guy, so like, I need to like see the visual, right? And so that's all the fun, I think, for me, like, actually whiteboarding with people. So anyway, I do think there are very interesting part of FigJam, though, like the fact that you can react in live and stuff like that. I think it makes a lot of sense. I actually think that my guess is that they were just looking how people collaborate in a Figma file anyway. And I don't know about you, but yeah, of course, like, when you work with somebody else on the same file, at one point you just want to type something to tell them how you feel about it, right? So it's just, to me, like a natural addition to that, like the natural evolution to actually get like a real whiteboarding session. Anyway, but I find it interesting. Okay, maybe what we can do, just to set up a little bit more context, is understand how you're using Figma professionally and maybe personally, if you do. But if you want, I'm going to start. So at Intuit, we're actually over 400 designers. So I feel like it's a big, I want to say it's a big design team, and we all moved to using Figma now. So that's interesting. So like, each like business units have their own Figma budget, like seats and stuff like that. But ultimately, I feel like this is where Figma shines out compared to other tools. And I personally feel like both time I did a switch to Figma, it was actually from Sketch. And my personal view, and again, it's not necessarily like it's just me, but I think Sketch is a great tool. I loved using it. I still would love to use it if honestly, like, I don't have time to do both, but like, I think the Sketch is a great tool. The problem was that, to me, like, they didn't evolve enough to actually start to make it really collaborative and make it work at an enterprise level. And so you had to add other tools on top of it, right? And Sketch was not necessarily, for me, like, the problem. It was the tools around it that were not necessarily super reliable. And obviously, I'm talking about Abstract, and then Zeppelin, and then InVision and stuff like that. And so, interestingly, we're starting to have comments in the chat. So I'm just going to stop here and show that Trudeau is listening with one earphone. So hi, Trudeau. Chudo was actually presenting at the config conference. So, if he wants to pop in, if he has time, I think it would be great. Taryn, say hi to Chudo, but hey, Taryn, she's actually a coworker of mine. And she's Team Figma for me. Yep, of course you are, Taryn. I know that. And then I don't have the privilege to know Bob, but you got this. So I don't know if it means one of us or all of us collectively, but yeah, we do got it. Anyway, so that's kind of like where I'm coming from with Figma. Like big companies struggling with, like I've never experienced it myself, but I've seen designers losing work over abstract, of having like forever before they actually like syncing abstract was taking forever and stuff like that. So they were basically like experiencing a lot of stuff. And I feel like, I don't know why, and I can only assume that Sketch didn't feel the need to go those ways, or they were too small to actually move faster. And they basically got, I think, like basically Figma surpassed them in certain ways, right? And so like both time, I feel like the companies where I was is like, hey, can we just simplify everything and just like have one tool that does it all and like teach everything, because it's just simpler and it works. So that's great. So that's my experience why we moved to Figma. But I don't know, Katie, Donat, you want to?
I have a question for you. I'm curious to know, when you moved to Figma, were you moving from Sketch in more of like a static way? Like you weren't using any of the cloud, like the Sketch cloud functionality? Were your designers actually having like Sketch files in a Dropbox somewhere?
Yeah. So no, we were not using Sketch Cloud for whatever reason. I don't think it ever like ramp up or whatever, or either because it was the very beginning when I was like my first company, or I feel like it was too little too late in my experience. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is kind of the vibe that I got. And yeah, of course, like when you started to work with other people, I guess you were just like sharing, like having either like Google Drive or Dropbox or whatever, and, like trying to get around with it, but it was obviously not a great like enterprise experience. So yeah.
Not scalable. That's kind of my experience. When I joined the company, we only had one designer at the time. This is like 3.5 years ago. So we have about 6 designers now, I think. And some of them were using Sketch like statically with Dropbox. And Dropbox, it really became like the pain point. It became a pain point when I started wanting to build some components like to represent our design system as assets and share. And that just is not scalable with static files. That's kind of like why we introduced Figma. And then I think as designers started to learn that they could collaborate with each other and just like open a browser tab and work on something, it just like took off really quickly, and we adopted pretty quickly that way.
Yeah. Again, I feel like, like if you're the only one master of a file, you're fine. But as like the minute you want somebody else to start to touch stuff, then it's over. So yeah. What about you, though?
Yeah. So I just kind of want to take a step back to when I started using Sketch, which is I was designing with Illustrator and Photoshop. I went on mat leave, and when I came back, it's like, oh, Sketch is the tool we use now. So it was like a learning curve to jump into it. But because of that, you kind of like want it to be successful. But like what you said, it really changed very slowly. And by the time like Figma is on deck, it's like they're already like ways ahead with like features and abilities that like Sketch, why don't you have these features? Like I'm talking to our connections in Sketch, and it's just like, it's coming, it's on the roadmap, it's in the backlog, and it's like, I really want you to win, but you're not making it easy. So the challenge is like, if you need it to collaborate, you have to use the tools that enable you.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because I did also like, I can't remember exactly what was the context, but I did remember reaching out to Sketch because there was like some bug or something that didn't work, something like that. and my relationship with the customer success was not that great. Like they took forever to reply, and when they did, they were basically implying that I was doing something wrong, something like that. I was like, yeah, I don't know if it's really what you want to go for, but okay. So I had to basically like prove myself that no, I was not inventing what I was talking about, or like I just feel like, from a customer experience, it was not. I remember not being great. I don't remember what it was, but I remember it was like, okay, cool. Anyway, yeah. And so actually, Donna, you made a very interesting point. I think that, as designers, I'm wondering what was like the successions of tools that you use. Personally, I think, so I did use Photoshop, I think mostly. Always hated Illustrator to build UI. I thought, I don't know why, but like Illustrator never worked for me. I understand that it's a great illustration tool, but for whatever reason, like the fact that it was not like pixel perfect or whatever, like the lines and stuff like that, I always thought it was messy in some ways. That's me. Just like you can tell me what you think. And so I was, I guess, in Photoshop for the longest time before I moved to Sketch, and then I moved to Figma. That said, because I'm also a front end developer, I feel like at one point it was also just like, for certain things, it was just quicker to just, like whip up a bit of HTML and CSS and trying to do whatever I wanted to do. But yeah, so I think that's me. I was actually a very heavy Flash user and programmer at one point. So I feel like that was also like, and that's interesting, I feel, because sometimes when I saw and I tried, like InVision, for example, like the big like InVision app that the InVision Studio, I believe it is. It was very early on, so I don't know how it went after that. I tried Adobe XD, but was not convinced at the time. Same thing, very early stage. So maybe it's actually maybe a lesson for them is like don't push it. If you're not actually 100% sure that this is a good product, maybe don't put it in our hands, because like the first impression kind of sticks. But anyway, I feel like sometimes when I saw like InVision Studio and trying to do like animation and stuff like that, I was like, cool, this is Flash 4. Like for all the good reason why we stopped using Flash, I also feel like the tool itself was awesome. And I'm still struggling to find this same experience in terms of like animation and capabilities and be able to actually do something a little bit more refined than just, like squares, static images of squares. But that's me. How about you, girls? Evolution, design tools. Who wants to go first?
I didn't do any Flash. I don't know. I've been an Adobe person my whole life. I feel like when I learned how to build websites from pictures, where you use Photoshop to build buttons as images and then make websites with all of your images. But once I learned Illustrator, I guess because I studied graphic design, I was working in Illustrator a lot more in school. That became my like go-to Adobe tool. And I think going from Illustrator to Adobe XD was a lot more natural. So that's probably why, like when it first came out, I was really impressed by XD. But I had never experienced Sketch at that point either. So I think coming from Illustrator to XD, it was like a natural progression.
Yep.
And yeah, I really never learned Sketch because I'm such an Adobe person. Like just that tooling was so ingrained in me that working in Sketch felt really foreign. Like I just could not figure out how to do anything. And I didn't really have a great reason to, because I'm also an engineer and I'd prefer to just design with CSS most of the time anyways.
A question for you. Did you try to use, I don't know, like Director or Dreamweaver, actually? In certain sense, you could draw stuff directly in Dreamweaver. So did you try that?
I remember trying Dreamweaver as a kid, like a pirated version, like as a kid on my orange
as a kid.
As a non-professional.
Yes, I'm my late 20s. So Yeah, I never I did try to use it. I guess that's kind of I probably tried to learn HTML and CSS from Dreamweaver at one point, but it never took off. Never used
Okay.
it really.
Interesting. And so what made the change for you between Adobe XD and Figma?
Just work, honestly.
Okay.
When Adobe XD came out, I was at my previous role and I was about to bring it to the company and say that we should be using this. And then I left the company and came to where I am now, where we had one designer who was using Sketch. So it didn't feel like the right time to introduce a tool. And then before we knew it, Figma was here, just taking over the industry. So I haven't opened XD in a while. I haven't opened a lot of Adobe products in a while because it's kind of hard to open Adobe products now.
I think that's my struggle of having so many design tools, is that you create these shortcuts and processes and I can do this, and then you switch to another one. It's like, why isn't this shortcut working? It's
Yeah.
Switching tools is pretty difficult when you want to do something really fast.
It's like a language. It's like if you know React really well and then you have a side project in Vue, it's kind of hard to get back into that context to build stuff.
Yeah, and for sure, I feel like, yes, the overall idea, I think, is that either it's in design or coding or even music, in creative ways anyway. The best tool is the tool that you know best, right? It's if you have there is definitely a learning curve for everything, and so I think it's as designers, we know that basically, if you want people to switch from one solution to another, then you really need to prove them that it's going to pay off in the end, because at first it takes a while to actually move from one tool to the other, and you need to really see the benefits up front to make that switch, right? But I think Figma for me was I think at first anyway, it was more other people that were more enthusiastic than me. I was okay, I guess, it's at least on par with Sketch, so I'm fine with that. And I see the benefit of using one tool. But I think Chudo made that comment, but I think I agree with him when he said that for him, the buy-in was they did component, override, instances, and constraint, right? Yeah, this is also maybe where I saw, oh yeah, this is, and maybe because I work on design system especially, I was this is actually pretty cool. And so anyway.
I think to that point, doing overrides, variants, right, really, it's to take away that work of creating those components and making it work right out of the box. Because sometimes with these tools is that in order to make variants and components work, is you have to work within the limitations of that tool. Like in Sketch, if you wanted variants, you literally have to create all the symbols. And then if you wanted nested symbols, it's almost okay, that's a different symbol. You couldn't nest those symbols. And so getting it right means having that connection and relationship in the components and variants. So to me, that's Figma getting it right. Whereas if in Sketch, you can still have those variants and symbols, it's just they're separated.
Yeah.
Do we think that Figma got it right? Has anybody here built a button variant yet? Because I did, and I have 600 copies of the same button.
I see thumbnails of that, of people's 500, 600 variants.
I don't know if I'm doing it wrong, but to me, if I want to show every single variant of one component, then I have to copy it every time. It's a lot. It's a ton of manual labor, which makes me nervous and wonder if this is the right path. I don't know. Do we how high fidelity should we actually be making our static assets in Figma? It's really fun,
Taryn.
But
sorry.
Taryn said that she has 1,005 instances. Well, I mean,
I want to see the picture.
Well, honestly, I think when you work in companies, I remember also, I was at a presentation from Adobe where they were actually talking about their design system. I can't remember the name of it now, but they were, Spectrum. And like between like I think they're supporting like 6 platforms. So obviously, like if you're looking at like just one button times 6 platforms, like it goes well pretty fast. And into it, I know that we're supporting right now 6 different themes, 3 platforms, and then light mode, dark mode. So everything is already like times 36. And so obviously, when you're talking about all the different states of a button, for example, then it's just like continue to multiply everything. So yeah, I mean, and this is probably, so to go back to what you were saying, Katie, I think that is Figma getting it right, or is it getting it better than most? And so I think that, yeah, to your point, I feel like, and I think it touches something that is even deeper than that, is that ultimately design tools are trying to mimic what's happening in code. And so there is also another drastic strategy around that, is that some tools like UXPin did like there are actually a brother engine, and they just render real code, like on the screen, And Figma is still on the other side, right? It's still an image. It's still a proxy. It's still not the real thing. And so I feel like, especially maybe Katie, you and I, especially because we're more hybrids or UX engineer and stuff like that, like we're always itching to actually have the real stuff. And I think it's interesting, and I think it's probably to me, like the thing that is mostly missing in Figma is the relationship between code and design artifacts. I don't believe that there is, and I know that some people are working on it, and even internally, like Figma plugins and stuff like that. Yeah, like I believe personally that we will never want to have a design tool that is producing production code. I don't believe it's going to happen anytime soon. And even if it did, I'm pretty sure that developers will still want to do it themselves. But I do believe the other way, meaning that if your design tool is able to interpret correctly the production code of your components so that you can actually use them directly in your design tool, that makes a whole lot more sense to me. And like I cannot help but think about Dreamweaver days when, yeah, it was like WYSIWYG, and like, yeah, you can just like ask it to do things. And I know that when I was looking at the code, I was like, wow, that's a lot. It's very verbose, and I can probably like optimize that. So I guess it works, but like you don't want to like look too close to what is actually produced in terms of code. So yeah. Anyway, what do you think? And especially you, Katie, because I feel like, would you feel comfortable if Figma was producing code? Let me simplify.
I mean, it is, and I don't look at it, and I wouldn't recommend anybody use it, probably. I don't know. I see both sides. That's kind of the problem of being a hybrid, I guess. You always see both sides. Because on one hand, I think as an engineer, it would be awesome if I could just build everything and just like serve it to Figma, and my designers can play around with the button that took me a much smaller amount of time to build every variant than it did by hand when I had to build 700 copies of the thing, and maybe it works. But how does the designer feel in that case? Because if it's all coming from code, then they don't necessarily have as much power to make changes. And like, what if, I think the argument is, should we go more towards designers building the thing in their design tool and influencing the code, because that gives them more power and control? But then you could argue, well, if you want more power and control, you could learn how to write CSS or HTML. But then it's like, well, should designers code? So it's like it's really hard to find the answer. And I think Figma is trying to like find a balance and give designers more power and tools. But from what I'm seeing, it kind of takes an engineer to build a variant in Figma, because otherwise you need to think through every single case, which is what an engineer is doing when they're building a component. So I don't know.
What do you think, Donna? You are the designer for us here, so
I do some coding and CSS. I think to kind of top up and like relate to this is on one hand, if you're just jumping in and you don't really code and you don't really do that, like Figma does a lot of things for you. But once you get into the nitty gritty of like, we're just talking about buttons. We're now designing like, okay, on hover, you want an outer border. You can't really achieve that with Figma because you only have the one layer of the button and you don't have kind of a box shadow setting. Like for me, I know what a box shadow is and it can be extended and offset, but Figma can't achieve that. And so now you start playing with the tool and like, okay, how can I make this button really fake, but then have my developer look at it and like, okay, so what is it that you want here? Because I see different things here. So I think it really should be advanced enough so that you can get to the code maybe somehow. But right now, I think it's kind of basic. It meets a lot of needs for a lot of people, but the wish is to get it more advanced.
No, I think it's interesting, but also I think that in what we're seeing right now, we're also very biased towards web, when actually, like I can see how, for example, like if like us, like we're supporting, like iOS and Android, and for example, drop shadows are drastically different from one platform to another, and it's not always possible to do the same thing everywhere. So I can see how, in a way, I do believe that system designers, what I call that is that really like designers that work on the design system and not necessarily like, like a product designer or somebody like that, but they should know very well the limitation of the medium that they work for, so the platform that they work for. At the same time, I do feel like it's almost like you should, like for a designer, you should know nothing or should know everything about it, right? It's like if you know nothing, then it can be actually sparkling great ideas because you don't know that it's not possible. And maybe you are paired with an awesome engineer like Katie, and Katie will say, actually, yes, it is possible. I have a solution for that, because ultimately I can see how a designer, if, like you're an architect or some kind of architect, like you have an idea and you have like a gesture or like a vision in your mind. And then it's up to an engineer to say how you can actually achieve that. Is it even possible, right? So I have like this balanced opinion of like, if you know nothing, it could be great because maybe you will have like really like out of the box kind of thinking and trying to offer something that has never done before, or very, very well what's possible. And then that makes you more educated in what is actually possible. Because I feel like sometimes I see designers that are limited by things that at one point somebody told them, but they don't know if it's still true or not. For example, Flightbox, Grid, like every day. I'm talking about the web because honestly, I have like zero experience in native development, but it's like things that used to be true are not true anymore, or maybe now there's like new ways to solve for certain problems. And I feel like, it's almost like what I would call like the garagist syndrome, right? Like somebody has the technical knowledge and you just have to trust them. And so sometimes it's like, like you're just refraining your creativity because you think that there's a limitation there, but actually maybe there is, maybe there's not. So anyway, I do think it's very interesting, though, that the whole idea of like the design tool being just an image. And so, yeah.
Yeah. To your point, I feel like you mentioned like pairing with an engineer, a designer pairing with an engineer and kind of talking through the interactions and the design. I feel like that's like the key thing. That, I mean, like everything, the answer is just communication and collaborating together. And I wonder sometimes about like if you're working so hard to make your Figma files super high fidelity, is that your like the best way to spend your time? Because if it's kind of, if you already have a design system in place, like in your code, and that's what your engineers are using, why do your designs need to be high fidelity? They could just reference the button, and then in discussion and like co-working with your engineer, you should be able to get to figure out that this is the primary variant. Like you shouldn't have to worry so much about the nuance of it. So I kind of feel like in some ways, high fidelity Figma components with 600 variants is kind of moving more towards waterfall, where you're just handing your designs to an engineer and and they're like starting from scratch with no context from you. And I feel like that's dangerous and not like the most productive way of working. So
yeah, especially because ultimately, I think, like auto layout is definitely helping, but I do feel like most of the time I'm actually advocating also designers to just not think about it as a fixed image, like especially if you're designing for web, things grow, shrink, like it's actually like the viewport changed drastically, like content, what is it? Container queries now are happening, and so, it's like there's a fluidity. Ah, I don't know how do you say that in English, but you got me.
got you.
Yeah. Anyway, my point is that I feel like now there's like you cannot just stop at a static image of something. Like as a developer, when I'm looking at it, I'm like, I want to see change. I want to see how it moves. It's like I cannot. It would be like, I don't know, like trying to do like a cartoon with just like one still image, and you're like, yeah, but like your character has a gravity, like it needs, it's like it has a center of gravity, and how does it move, and what's its personality, right? It's like it depends on motion and stuff like that. And so anyway, I feel like it's still limited in certain ways. And interestingly, back in 2017, actually, I think I preparing for this stream, I was actually looking back to an article that I posted on Medium about what was my wish list for a design tool, and I did mention the fact that it should actually work in 4 dimensions, meaning 3 dimensions plus time, and we're far from it. And so it's like there's still a lot of stuff need to be there. But yeah, I don't know. Are you actually? Did you try? I know there's like some Figma plugins to talk about animation, but maybe we should actually dive in a little bit. Are you using animation in some ways in Figma? Did you have like any success stories or pain points that you have to share?
Well, first of all, there's a plugin for literally everything. So anytime you're just like, how do I do X? You just look for a plugin and it exists. We haven't done a ton of animation. There is like the new, what do they call it? The interactive components now that's in beta that you can sign up for. And I've tested it and it's kind of interesting. So you could like hook things together and have hover states or like on click, which I've tried like putting into a component, but I don't know how safe that is. I don't know if I would want that inside of a component. I think it's maybe better suited for designers like using in their prototypes to actually like hook up components. Mm-hmm. But they're definitely trying to offer more interactions. I think one thing that I struggled with this week, we have like a scrolling box component, which is like a carousel, like, that you would scroll through. And I think I spent like an hour just staring at Figma, like, should I try to build this in here? Like this is super interactive. I could go read like 7 tutorials on how to build this thing. Is it worth it? Because it's not hard to make in code and it's like easy enough. And it's like those kind of points that I find myself hitting a lot where I just feel like it's not worth the time to build this high fidelity scrolling container.
I would read your article though.
Yeah, maybe I'll learn how.
Yeah, but I think you're making a very good point. It's like, isn't it anyway the intent to go as fast as possible to the actual outcome, which is code in the end? It's like no user will experience your Figma prototype, so what's the point? I mean, I do see the point as conveying the message to whoever is going to build this thing for real, right? And so, like, if you need it to convey that message, then yeah, it's worth it. But if you don't need it, what's the point, right? And so I feel like, like it should be always like thinking about what is the most direct path and the fastest path to actually get production code ready and up to what was your vision in the first place, right? But yeah,
Bob in the chat mentioned testing, which is a good point. Like if you make really high fidelity tests in Figma, you could use them for user testing. But I would argue, as an engineer, I can build that prototype way faster with just some static markup, like in Storybook, and I can have a real link for the user to test it in. So it just depends on your tools, really. Maybe you're super fast at building in Figma, and that is like better for you for user testing. But in the end, if you test something that you built with code and it works out, well, then you're halfway there to shipping your MVP.
Yeah, well, it depends if your prototype is like prototype code or like a little bit more refined, and how much you can salvage from your prototype to actually build the real thing. But I think prototype in itself is actually, we should have like another stream just to talk about prototypes and what are they good for and where to use them and what level of fidelity should you use to actually build prototypes in the context of a design system. But yeah, no, I think you're making a great point here. Sorry. Donut, are you using animation so far? Because I feel like interactive components is kind of that, but not exactly, like true animation in terms of, I don't know, like you have, like a real animation somewhere.
I think a lot of the other designers in the teams have been animating their prototypes. But for me, because I'm so focused on just like the system things, the system components, I haven't had the need to, because that level of within the design tool, I don't think it's my place to tell them how to animate. So not very.
So I'm gonna sidetrack a little bit, but do you believe that motion should be part of your design system then?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that should be like a big chunk of our documentation of the design system, and it should be part of that tool for sure.
But not necessarily implemented in Figma, you mean? Like in your Figma library, for example?
I haven't gone to that point of like, how do we include it and how do we use it? Is it available?
I don't think so, but I think it would be interesting to know if we can actually. I'm thinking about like micro interactions and stuff like that, right? It's like, if you don't have them there, is it a problem? Is it not a problem? It's like to all the things that we touched, right? It's like, how do you test it? How do you prototype it? I personally, that's a pet peeve of mine. I hate when people are using After Effects to build software, because I'm like, it's to make a movie. I understand that you don't have a better tool, but this situation sucks. We need to solve for that. Because to me, it's like you're showing me a movie. Cool. But should you be using like a tool that is made for film production to actually show me like a motion for a software? I just find it weird. But yeah, that's me.
I think if it were me, I would go straight to the browser and just play with CSS to work on animating things, just because that's where I'm comfortable. But I do think that it's important to have it in Figma in some way. Like just today, I saw a spec from a designer where he was taking a card and like growing it and expanding it on hover. So him having that, he doesn't write code, so having that like ability in Figma to think about that was like very interesting. And I think I'm sitting there thinking about how would I engineer this, but just for him to have that as an option, it kind of allows him to be creative. Yeah,
and just so I elaborate a little bit about the fact that I hate After Effects, is that if you're showing me a movie, it doesn't actually give me like the curve or the like the ease function or whatever. It's like, I need to like try to mimic whatever you've done. It's like it feels to me that it's really not the most efficient way to reproduce whatever you did. And so yes, like in Figma, if we can have animation where as a developer I can look at it, and she is in a meeting. So basically like being able to actually look at what are the specification of that motion that you want is crucial for me. So yeah, I feel like at least if Figma does it well, then it means that yes, you can export some kind of, like understanding where's the curve, what are you moving, are you expanding, shrinking, sliding, like there's a lot of stuff to be defined for sure, but to recreate the animation at a pixel perfect level. So anyway. Yeah. Cool. There's another topic that I actually wanted to talk about in terms of Figma is, because we're design system people, is that how do you feel about the integration of design tokens? Is it something that you're using day in and day out or not yet? It's rough.
I think it's rough. So I actually just separated out. We had one library with our components and our styles, and I just separated out our styles into its own library because whatever reason we were having a lot of trouble publishing and things were getting lost. They would just go missing. But my biggest issue, well, I have a couple issues, but our design tokens in code, we name they're very long, they're very verbose names of what they are. And you just can't do that in Figma. There's no space and things just get cut off. So it's why am I adding all this context to this name if you can't read the whole thing? You also can't chain things together. And we have 4 levels of chaining in our code. And I'd love to be able to do that in Figma because without it, I can never decide, which one should I use? Should I use the constant tokens? Should I use the theming tokens? Because it might not really matter to the design tool, but if an engineer is inspecting it, they might see that I've used a constant token and I don't actually want them to use that. I want them to use the contextual one, and they're going to get confused, and they have gotten confused. So I think those are my 2 biggest things, just being able to name things better and being able to chain together and pereference and use an alias, basically. Those are my pet peeves.
No, and FYI, I do know that Figma is looking into that and incorporating design tokens. So personally, adding to it, we're actually leveraging Style Dictionary. We have our own instance of Style Dictionary to again, as I mentioned, 6 themes, 3 modes, 3 platforms, 2 mode. So we do have a pretty extensive Style Dictionary setup to actually override values and design tokens along the line. And so I know that Figma is working. Everybody's working in on that. All the design tools I feel are probably thinking about it. But yeah, I think it's in my mind anyway, it's a big point that is missing, and it's hard to actually nail it down. It's very complex. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I'd like to be able to use Figma to think through those chains. How would I chain things? Because I like to use Figma as a kind of a way of thinking through the mechanics of the technology behind it, like the CSS or the component API, and you just can't right now. But I have a question. Are you using, so you have Stylent, are you do you have a plugin that's automatically pulling tokens in from your code, or are you still manually adding everything?
That's a very good question. We are actively right now working on, building Figma plugins for exactly that. The way I see it, it's a 2-way street. It's we want to be able to build the trust of designers and saying whatever you see in Figma is coming directly from the design token, so that all those styles, those styles and value are actually the correct ones, that are coming from our design system. So that's from Style Dictionary to Figma. And the other side to me is as important is actually, what if a designer can just change a value inside of Figma, and ultimately, I don't want it to be 100% automatic, but just have somebody that is able to review that change and bless it to actually integrate it in Style Dictionary. Is probably the other way around. For us, it basically means probably automatically create a PR that somebody else can review. I think that would be awesome, and that's where we're heading towards. That's what we want to try.
Does that include creating new tokens?
Well, I think it's going to be trickier, but Ideally, yes, but at least be able to modify whatever already exists. I think it's probably your first step. But yeah, like ultimately, like be able to create that. And even that, it's actually pretty hard because like I can see how what I would call foundational tokens are pretty straightforward, right? It's like your color palette, cool. But I think, Caddy, I don't know if you said, for your components tokens, how do you call them? Like there's basically like a probably a middleware that is more like semantic. And
Yep.
so I think you said contextual or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So how do you change those is way trickier, I think. And also there is an implied logic that you cannot really clearly visualize right now. Like meaning, like if you have like a semantic token that is called, I don't know, UI primary color or whatever, it does mean that then this thing is actually used in certain places. So this is also another thing where I don't know if it needs to be part of a design tool, but you definitely need a way to visualize that because otherwise nobody knows what are the consequences of changing this value until you actually look at the output, right? And so there's no clear way to actually show that.
I think the ask for the design tool to have that is important because like again, you have a plugin for that, and then the expectation is all the companies have to create plugins. So I think the tool should have that and should have the ability to have the global token and the alias token.
Yeah. But it's going to add a lot of complexity for sure. Yeah, Donna is having two conversations at the same time. She's multitasking, as every good parent is. I want to say so. Kudos to you, Donna. Anyway, but yeah, so yeah, I don't see like a bright future anytime soon on that, but I do see that. I also know that all the design tools, like most design tools, are actually participating in the W3C design token group. So I'm sure that they're trying to get a standard across the board. I think it's going to be like, it's great that they're all participating, and I'm hoping that when they will get there, because obviously like interoperability between tools would be nice to have. But yeah, we're almost at time, meaning that we've been chatting for over 52 minutes now. But there is one thing that I want to talk about, and it's a little bit more controversial, I guess, is that I'm starting to fear that Figma is doing too many things. And where I'm coming from is that I've seen it before. I've been in this industry for over 20 years now. And, it's like you start to use a tool and it's a great tool. And so you want to use it for everything and everywhere. And then to keep up, they just keep on adding features and features and features. And then it starts to be very complex and super hard to use and buggy because, things are implication here and there and stuff like that, until you find another tool that is very efficient at doing one thing. And so you jump ship and then start a new one. And so one of the examples that I have for that is that I've seen people starting to have, for example, their documentation hosted inside of Figma.
Like written documentation?
Yeah, like design specs and stuff like that, and written documentation. Uber does that, for example. That's the most famous design system that is actually using it. In their context, I can understand also it because they're not mainly web-based. So maybe it makes more sense for them to do that because ultimately, it would not necessarily make sense to have a website that showcase their components if they're not web-based anyway. You need anyway to have like some kind of proxy or artifact to actually show the native experience. So maybe understand a little bit more, and that's my opinion. But I do believe that Figma is not meant to be a documentation portal, and you cannot search in it, for example, and stuff like that. So I personally advocate for not using it as a documentation tool. At the same time, I understand designers are like, hey, I'm already in Figma, and it's a great tool. So why not just use it for that too, right? And so, but I do see how one, I think it actually restrain the audience of the documentation, but because suddenly you need to have access to Figma to be able to access it. And also you're basically using the tool for what it is not meant to be. But yeah, it's like, yeah, it's like using Word to write HTML. Yeah, you can do it. It's possible, but is it really what you're supposed to do with it? I don't think so. Anyway, do you have an opinion on that?
I mean, I would never write a document with Figma. I hate writing text in Figma. I don't know why. It's very hard. It's just not the same as like starting a Notion doc or a Word doc or whatever. But
well, it's not meant for that, right?
No, I do kind of like using Figma for unconventional things. Well, maybe not unconventional, but like for instance, I just put together a deck the other day and I used Figma instead of like Google Slides.
Yeah.
And it was so pleasant. It was just like really nice to work with. I don't think I would go back to using Google Slides at this point. And I was kind of surprised by how easy it was. And I've also used it, like I do some vector art sometimes, and I would always use Illustrator to work on SVGs, like always. And now I'm just reaching for Figma to work on SVGs, and it's quite nice, and it's just a lot easier and it's faster. So I don't know, but I see what you're saying. I know a lot of designers are using Figma to make their portfolios, basically like a portfolio website, which, because you can't search it, I guess wouldn't be ideal. But it's, I guess, technically a free option for you depending on your plan. But maybe like something like Webflow would be a better option for that. You're always going to get people using the tool unconventionally, I think.
Well, I mean, using it unconventionally is one thing, but if the tool then pushes to actually make it more conventional as integrated in the tool is where I feel like it starts to be problematic in my mind anyway. Or like, I see it how like being a risk to actually, having just like an over-engineered, over-complex tool that can do it all, but actually, no, it's like just too hard to use or too buggy or whatever, but yeah.
Yeah, like we never get our alias components or tokens because they've built a Word document processor inside of Figma instead.
Yeah.
Be pretty disappointed.
What about you, Donna? What do you think?
I think one of the features that when you're looking at Figma is the ability to kind of export to like Storybook, like kind of connect to documentation rather than, I guess, I haven't really thought of using it to document itself. I would probably use it if it was specific to using Figma, the tool, for the components. Like here are some caveats and for the designers to understand.
Yeah.
That's as much as documentation in Figma as I got.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I think I actually would love to have documentation integrated in Figma. I just don't believe that Figma should be the source of the documentation. Meaning that being able to surface it in Figma, great. But it shouldn't be where you actually where you're editing or authoring your documentation, And I remember Polaris, so Shopify, doing a Sketch plugin to actually get their documentation coming from their website integrated in Sketch. It was a Sketch plugin. And this is more like what I'm like. If I'm thinking about documentation in Figma, I would much prefer to have something like that, where actually the source of the documentation is somewhere else, and maybe like a content as a service solution or whatever, that you can actually surface it when your users are. Because as design system people, I feel like it's better to meet our users where they are. So do I think that a designer should go to a website to have an answer to their question when they're actually in the flow of, in their design tool? Probably not. It's probably disruptive. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that that Figma is good to build a website, or, something more complex than that. Anyway, well, we've been chatting for almost an hour, so I hope you had fun. I definitely did. But do you have anything that you want to add, or like a very specific point on Figma that you want to say? Like, do you love it? Do you love Figma? Do you feel like you're gonna use it for the next 20 years, or what's your what's your conclusion here?
That's tough to say because, like, if you look at it, like how old is Figma versus like where it is right now? Like, how can you say 20 years if it's, in a couple of years it could be something different?
Oh yeah, for sure. What about you, Katie? Any
I love
final words?
Figma. I really love it. It has definitely changed the game for me. And this has been very therapeutic to discuss some of the pain points and some of the stuff we really like about it. So I've had a lot of fun.
Cool. Great. Well, I hope to both see you. Oh, yeah. Well, I guess Donna is done. Anyway, well, it was great to have you. Thank you very much for coming today. And I hope we'll see you around next time we do another live stream. I'm hoping to be like a little bit better at actually have some kind of cadence. So, let's hope that it's not going to be in too far. But thanks everybody for joining us today and being in the chat and chatting with us. Or I think it's way more fun like that when we have some interaction with the audience. So Donna, thank you. Katie, thank you. And I'll see you around.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.